You won't believe what happened when one woman tried to tear apart a family just because of a guide dog. But the real twist? It backfired in the most unexpected way. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. Mark had always dreamed of moving to a peaceful, family-friendly neighborhood where his 14-year-old blind son, Jacob, could grow up safely. When he finally found the perfect house in a suburban community, he thought his struggles were over. Jacob, who had been blind since birth due to a rare genetic condition, had always relied on his guide dog, Rex, a highly trained golden retriever, to navigate the world with confidence. Rex wasn't just a pet, he was Jacob's lifeline. He ensured that Jacob could move around without fear, go to school, and even play outside like any other kid. For the first few days after moving in, things seemed to be going well. Their new neighbors were polite, and some even stopped by to welcome them. Jacob loved the house, especially the backyard, where he could safely play with Rex under his father's watchful eye. Everything seemed perfect until Karen Middleton introduced herself. Karen was the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, serving as the HOA president with an iron fist. She was notorious for enforcing rules that only seemed to benefit her and making life miserable for anyone who didn't fall in line. The first time she approached Mark, it was under the pretense of welcoming them. However, the conversation quickly took a sharp turn when her eyes landed on Rex. "Excuse me, but I know we have a strict pet policy in this neighborhood," she said, narrowing her eyes. "Dogs over 30 pounds are not allowed." Mark, who had dealt with his fair share of ignorant people over the years, remained calm. "Rex isn't just a dog. He's a certified guide dog for my son, Jacob. He's legally protected under the ADA, so HOA rules don't apply here." Karen scoffed. "Rules are rules. And frankly, I don't think a dog that big is safe around children. What if he bites someone? Or what if he barks all night and disturbs the peace?" Mark clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure. Rex is a professionally trained service animal. He doesn't bark, he doesn't bite, and he's here because my son needs him. Karen's lips curled into a fake smile. "Well, we'll see about that," she muttered before walking away. From that day on, Karen made it her mission to get rid of Rex. At first, it was just passive-aggressive letters in the mailbox. Mark received multiple HOA violation notices demanding Rex's removal, citing absurd reasons like unsightly fur, potential allergies for neighbors, and disrupting the neighborhood aesthetic. He ignored them. Then, she began spreading malicious rumors. Karen told neighbors that Rex was an aggressive and unpredictable dog. She claimed he had barked at her and lunged during one of her morning walks. Most neighbors saw through her lies and dismissed them, but a few nosy ones began eyeing Mark's house warily. Things escalated when Karen started calling animal control, not once, but multiple times, to complain that Rex was an unregistered, dangerous animal. She fabricated claims that Rex had been seen wandering off-leash, scaring children, and even growling at residents. Every single claim was false, but Karen was persistent. One afternoon, when Mark was at work and Jacob was home alone, there was a knock at the door. Jacob, who relied on Rex to guide him, hesitated before making his way over. "Hello," he called out. "Animal control, kid. We're here about the dog." Jacob's heart pounded. "What about him?" "We received a complaint that there's an unlicensed and aggressive dog in this house. We need to take him for evaluation." Jacob's hands shook as he fumbled for his phone. He didn't know what to do. Rex was his best friend, his eyes, his protector. "He's not aggressive. He's my guide dog." The officers exchanged glances but remained firm. "We still have to take him. If you have paperwork proving he's a guide dog, your dad can present it later." Tears welled up in Jacob's eyes as he frantically dialed his father. "Dad, they're trying to take Rex." His voice trembled. Mark, who had just sat down at work, bolted out of his chair the moment he heard his son's panicked voice. "I'm coming home. Do not let them take him." Speeding all the way back, Mark arrived just in time to find two animal control officers standing on his porch, holding a leash attached to Rex. Jacob stood beside them, clutching Rex's collar with both hands, his face pale with fear. "What the hell is going on?" Mark demanded. "Sir, we received multiple reports about this dog being a threat to the community. one officer explained. Your HOA president filed an official complaint stating that the dog is aggressive and potentially dangerous. Mark scoffed. That's complete nonsense. This is a guide dog, a certified service animal. This is discrimination. The officer hesitated. Do you have paperwork to prove that? Mark didn't waste another second. He pulled out his phone and opened an email from Rex's trainer, showing every certification, health record, and legal document protecting Rex under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Take a good look, Mark said, his voice icy. Now tell me, does the law agree with your HOA, Karen? The officers examined the documents and exchanged uneasy glances. One of them sighed. This all checks out. We shouldn't have been called for this in the first place. Karen, who had been watching from her porch, stormed over in outrage. Why aren't you taking the dog? He's a threat. He's dangerous. The officer turned to her, unimpressed. Ma'am, this is a legally protected service dog. He's not going anywhere. But he barked at me, she shrieked. He's a menace. The officer folded his arms. We've checked his records. He's up to date on everything, and there's zero evidence of aggression. Filing false reports to animal control is a serious offense, ma'am. Karen's face turned beet red. You don't understand. The HOA has rules. Mark smirked. Yeah? Well, the law is bigger than your little HOA. With that, the officers unclipped the leash and returned it to Mark. Rex, as if sensing the victory, let out a single happy woof, making Karen flinch. She stomped away in fury, realizing her plan had completely failed. But Mark knew Karen wasn't done yet. If she was willing to go this far, she'd probably try something even worse next time. And he was ready for it. After the animal control incident, Mark thought it was finally over. Karen had been humiliated in front of the officers, and Rex was safe back at home with Jacob. But Mark quickly learned that Karen's obsession with enforcing her will was far from finished. What had started as petty complaints and personal vendettas against a family trying to live in peace was now escalating into a full-on battle. Mark's phone buzzed with notifications for the next few days. There were multiple HOA violation notices in his mailbox, each one containing a different bogus reason for demanding Rex's removal. The HOA had officially declared that Rex, despite his legal status as a guide dog, was in violation of their pet policy. The paperwork stated that, regardless of his status as a service animal, the inconvenience his presence was allegedly causing to the community needed to be addressed. But Mark wasn't about to back down. He knew the law, and he knew Karen's tactics all too well. He immediately contacted a lawyer specializing in disability rights and began preparing to fight back legally. He wasn't just defending Rex. He was defending his son's right to live without harassment and be treated equally under the law. His lawyer, Alexis Torres, was confident that they had a solid case. These people can't just override federal law with petty HOA rules. You've got the documentation, and they're making false accusations. If they want to play dirty, we'll play dirty too, Alexis told Mark during their initial consultation. It wasn't just about lawsuits and paperwork. It was about standing up for what was right. Mark had to think of Jacob, who, although he couldn't see, could feel every ounce of tension in their home. Jacob had started to become anxious whenever someone knocked on the door or when the phone rang. He would hear his father on the phone, explaining legal jargon and terms that Jacob didn't fully understand but could sense were linked to dangerous situations. He loved Rex more than anything in the world, and the thought of losing him, his one true companion, was devastating. But Mark also found unexpected allies in the community. A neighbor named Melissa, who had witnessed Karen's overreach firsthand, called Mark one evening to express her support. Mark, I just wanted you to know that you're not alone. Karen has been pushing people around here for years. She tried to tell me I couldn't paint my fence the color I wanted, and it's not like she's anyone special. This is our neighborhood, not hers. You don't have to fight her alone. I'm behind you 100%. Mark was grateful for Melissa's support. In the following days, other neighbors who had been too intimidated to speak up began reaching out. They had seen Karen's lies and knew she had a history of bullying other residents. One elderly couple, the Harrisons, were especially vocal. Mrs. Harrison had seen Karen's unjust tactics firsthand when Karen had tried to get their grandson's dog removed from the neighborhood. Mrs. Harrison had even filed a complaint with the HOA about Karen's conduct, but had gone largely ignored. Now, seeing Karen attack a child with a disability, she was furious. The tide began to turn as the community rallied behind Mark. In response to Karen's escalating harassment, Mark decided to hold a community meeting in the neighborhood clubhouse. He invited everyone who had been impacted by Karen's antics, everyone who had seen her misuse her power. At the meeting, Alexis, the lawyer, explained the situation to the group, highlighting Karen's illegal attempts to force Mark and Jacob out of the neighborhood. She emphasized how Karen had failed to recognize federal protections for people with disabilities, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which guaranteed service animals like Rex the right to accompany their handlers in public spaces and private residences. The room was filled with supportive neighbors who had finally realized the extent of Karen's abuses. The mood shifted from one of concern to one of resolve. Mark felt an immense weight lift off his shoulders as people, many of whom had been passive in the past, now spoke up in support of his family. "We won't let her push us around," one neighbor, Diana, said. "This is ridiculous. My cousin has a service dog, and if anyone tried to take her dog away, I'd be standing right there next to her in a heartbeat." Another neighbor, Kyle, added, "I've lived here for 10 years, and I've seen this woman get away with far too much. It's time to put a stop to it. If she wants to play dirty, we could do the same." With community backing and Alexis' legal expertise, Mark knew it was time to take action. They filed an official complaint with the HOA, accusing Karen of harassment, discrimination, and making false reports to animal control. The legal action wasn't just about getting Karen to back off. It was about forcing the HOA to recognize their mistake and stop supporting her unlawful actions. Mark was prepared to take this to court if necessary. But Karen, of course, didn't back down. In response to the growing community support for Mark and the mounting legal pressure, she ramped up her attacks. She began sending threatening letters to Mark, warning him that she would sue him for defamation and for encouraging neighbors to go against her. She even sent hate mail to Jacob, making cruel remarks about his disability and insinuating that his dog wasn't truly necessary for his safety. The cruelty was almost unbelievable, but it only strengthened Mark's resolve. Then came the turning point. The HOA, finally realizing the potential legal fallout from their support of Karen's actions, began to backtrack. In a surprise move, they scheduled a meeting to address the matter. Mark, Alexis, and a number of community supporters showed up at the meeting. When Karen arrived, she was met with a much less receptive audience than she had anticipated. "I've done nothing wrong," Karen declared, trying to raise her voice over the murmurs from the crowd. "I'm just trying to enforce the rules." But the board members, now fully aware of the public backlash, didn't seem as inclined to support her. After a tense back and forth, the HOA president called for a vote. In a landslide decision, the HOA voted in favor of Mark and Jacob, affirming that Rex was protected under the law and could stay in the neighborhood. Karen's power had been officially diminished, and her reputation within the community was tarnished beyond repair. Mark had won, thanks to the support of his neighbors, his lawyer, and the unbreakable bond between him and his son. Jacob, who had been quiet throughout the ordeal, finally smiled as Rex nudged his hand, letting out a soft, reassuring bark. The battle was over, and for the first time in weeks, they could finally breathe easy. But the victory wasn't just about keeping Rex. It was about sending a powerful message that no one, not even the most self-righteous HOA president, had the right to take away the dignity and rights of others. Karen's harassment backfired, and the community had stood united in the face of her cruelty. After the HOA's vote in Mark's favor, Karen's world seemed to crumble. The decision was a huge blow to her ego, her reputation, and her influence within the neighborhood. No longer was she the unquestioned authority who could dictate who belonged in the community and who didn't. The word had spread fast. People were starting to see Karen for what she truly was, a woman who cared more about enforcing her petty rules than the well-being of her neighbors. Her bullying tactics, once unchallenged, had finally caught up to her, And it wasn't just Mark and his family who were suffering the consequences of her actions. The first sign that the tide had turned came when Karen's allies began distancing themselves from her. For years, she had manipulated and intimidated people into supporting her, but after the court of public opinion had turned on her, that support evaporated almost overnight. The once tightly knit group of Karen's followers, those who blindly supported her petty enforcements, were now backing away, realizing that their loyalty to her was a liability. Neighbor after neighbor stopped waving at Karen on the street. Invitations to neighborhood events that she used to receive were no longer extended. Her attempts to confront people in the community about the situation were met with cold stares and dismissive remarks. The neighbors, who had been hesitant to get involved in the past, now felt emboldened to speak out. Mark had become a symbol of standing up against the HOA's overreach. But it wasn't just the neighbors who had turned against Karen. It was also her fellow HOA members. The same HOA board that had backed her for so long was now starting to question her leadership. Karen had relied on her position as HOA president for years, using it as a platform to push her own agenda and ensure that her rules were followed to the letter. But now, the very people she had once manipulated were openly criticizing her. Some had even begun questioning whether her personal vendetta against Mark and Jacob had clouded her judgment. One member of the HOA board, James, who had previously been one of Karen's staunchest supporters, came to Mark after the vote. He explained that the internal fallout had been severe. "Mark, I just want to apologize. I had no idea how far Karen would go to make you guys miserable. I don't know what kind of hold she had over us, but she's been pulling the strings for years. I should have said something sooner, but I'm glad this has finally come to light." That was a turning point. The HOA was now on shaky ground. The board was discussing whether they should hold a new election to replace Karen as president. Karen's control over the community had been broken. The only people still supporting her were a small handful of her closest friends, but even they were starting to backpedal. Meanwhile, the community's support for Mark only grew stronger. After the meeting where the HOA sided with him, the local news station caught wind of the story. The headline read, "Neighborhood wins against HOA bullying. A family fights back and triumphs over unjust rules." Mark found himself suddenly thrust into the spotlight. He didn't expect any of this to happen when he moved to the neighborhood. All he wanted was a safe, peaceful life for Jacob. But as the story spread, he realized that their victory was part of a much bigger conversation about the power of HOA boards, discrimination against service animals, and standing up to unjust authority. Mark was contacted by a variety of local advocacy groups, including those focused on disability rights and service animals. They praised his courage in standing up to Karen and encouraged him to speak out on behalf of other families who had faced similar discrimination. Mark was hesitant at first. He didn't want the spotlight. He just wanted his son to have a safe home. But he began to see the importance of using his voice to help others. "I never thought this would become such a big deal," Mark confessed during an interview. "But I'm realizing now that we're not just fighting for our family. We're fighting for anyone who's ever felt like they were pushed out of the community or made to feel less than because of the way they live or who they are." Throughout this time, Jacob had been watching everything unfold. He didn't fully understand the legal battles, but he felt the support from the neighbors, from the lawyer, and from his dad. The anxiety that had been growing in him slowly began to fade as he realized that Rex wasn't going anywhere. Rex, his faithful guide dog, was there to stay. They could go back to their normal lives. And even better, they could do so knowing that Karen would no longer have the power to hurt them. But despite all the community support, Karen had one final, desperate attempt left in her. She hired an attorney and filed a lawsuit against Mark, claiming defamation and emotional distress. She argued that her reputation had been ruined by the accusations, that she had been unfairly portrayed as a villain, and that the community's treatment of her had caused irreparable harm to her social standing. The legal team that Mark had worked with was unfazed. "Let her try," Alexis, his lawyer, said when they received the lawsuit. "This is nothing more than a scorched earth tactic. If she wants to drag this out, we'll just file a counterclaim for harassment, and we'll add the HOA into the suit for enabling her behavior." Let's see how quickly she wants to back out of this. The lawsuit never made it past the initial stages. Karen's case was so weak that her own attorney eventually advised her to drop it. The counterclaim was looming, and the HOA had already made it clear that they would no longer support her. The embarrassment of having to face the truth was too much. Karen withdrew the lawsuit, and at that moment, she disappeared from the community. The final blow to her reputation came when the HOA officially held an election to replace her as president. Mark didn't want to get involved in HOA politics, but the board had been so disorganized and dysfunctional under Karen's leadership that it was clear something had to change. In the end, James, the former supporter of Karen, was voted in as the new president. James was fair-minded and committed to transparency, and he made it a point to rebuild trust in the HOA by prioritizing the needs of the residents over petty rules. As for Mark and Jacob, life slowly returned to normal. They no longer lived in fear of a knock at the door or a letter from Karen. Mark continued to work, and Jacob began to relax, knowing that Rex was with him every step of the way. They had won, not just for themselves, but for the entire neighborhood. They had stood up for their rights, and in doing so, they had made their community stronger. In the end, Karen's vindictive actions not only destroyed her own life, but also revealed a deeper, systemic issue within the HOA that had been swept under the rug for far too long. Mark's resilience, the support of his neighbors, and the strength of their bond had triumphed over her cruelty. It had been a hard-fought battle, but it was one that would resonate in their neighborhood for years to come. The victory was not just legal, it was moral, and it was a victory for everyone who believed in fairness, justice, and human dignity.